We're now going to turn our attention to the way information goes through social networks and factors that affect whether information is disseminated. We're really working here off of the Southwell book, so hopefully this will explain some of the concepts that may not have been clear in your reading. So let's start with social networks. What is it that makes networks work and not work so well? Well, certain factors we can think about involve structural cohesion. Um, Networks can be characterized by strong or weak structural cohesion. The greater the connections between nodes within a network, the stronger the cohesion of the group and the greater likelihood that information is going to be shared. We can also look at the strength of relationships within those groups. The people with whom you've had the longest and deepest contact tend to be stronger connections, and intimacy, reciprocity, and intensity, as well as how long you've known someone, these are all things that are going to affect the likelihood of sharing information. Another thing that we can look at is what Southwell refers to as clustering. In general, not all nodes are equal in their connections. Social networks tend to involve clustering behavior. So some people act as hubs, while other people may be relatively isolated. And we tend to see an unequal distribution of connection and information sharing. We can look at noticing that there are groups, really, that there are multiple social networks, and each has its own dynamics. Think about your friend groups. That probably helps understand this, right? So we can also recognize that these groups, there are strong ties and weak ties. So there can be strong and weak ties within networks, and various networks may be characterized by different levels of connection. So research shows us, though, that what we really need are links between networks. So this is bridging. For the diffusion of information, you need connections between networks. This bridging function allows the spread of information from one group to another. And when there aren't bridges between networks, the result is isolation. Social networks without those bridges become isolated, and they won't get access to important information. They can become echo chambers. This is especially important when we're thinking about misinformation and disinformation around health. So we're really looking at the ways information is not only sort of disseminated, but amplified, and when information gets stuck. And we see this in health contexts, and we see this in political contexts as well. We also need to think about various types of information sharing behaviors. Southwell identifies several types. We can start with conversation. These are face-to-face and people interacting and talking. For Southwell, conversations actually involve influence, not merely monologues. So if you're tuning someone out, that's not really a conversation. So those who are in conversation with each other, by this definition, are co-present and oriented to the same topic. Another type of information sharing that Southwell identifies is forwarding. This is like your grandfather sending you something online, something that they read. When I was younger, my grandfather would actually clip things out of the newspaper and mail it to me. Now, you get forwarded information. So those forwarded emails. Now, not all information that you receive is necessarily true. This kind of forwarding can also take place on social media. So when it's in that context, we think about it in different ways. So there's an overt endorsement. This is like liking a post or on Facebook or other social media apps. And, the degree of liking is also important. Is it a heart? Is it an angry face? Are we sad? So that kind of overt comment matters. But there's another level that takes it a bit more, which is with commentary and co-option. It's the difference between sharing an article you saw versus sharing it with comments. So if I retweet an article, it means one thing. But if I retweet and say something about it, then I'm adding this extra level. I'm adding commentary. Whenever you're doing that, you're really adding more to it and including further effort. So blog posts that incorporate links and elaborate, YouTube videos, mashups, things on TikTok. Anytime you're doing that, you're adding an extra level, and that kind of extra effort carries extra weight with other people. Another type we can see is referrals. This is when you refer a friend to something. And that could be, commercial offers. A lot of companies, in order to get some kind of discount, they ask you to give up names of friends and family. You can see this with Groupons, etc. Those could also be more personal referrals. Who's the good handyman, music teacher, who's a doctor you want, what's a good political source of information. All of those things, when they're personal from people, that has higher abilities of people to intake that information. We can also think about what works in terms of which messages are shared. The structure of messages really matters. So we'll talk more about this later when we're talking about messaging, but just briefly, when Southwell's going through it, he identifies some things like the rhetorical structure that has rhetorical ellipsis. And this is a way of constructing messages that Southwell says is highly effective. And it means that the message requires people to fill in the blanks a little. So it doesn't make sense completely on its own. You make the audience really work for it. And part of the strength of that is that the receiver of the message, because they've had to put in that cognitive work, they own it more and they internalize it. But a problem with that is the weakness here is that if people don't have the required information to fill in the blank, the message may not be effective. And people might be embarrassed to ask for information for clarity if they don't understand it. So you have to be really careful when designing those messages. We can also look at emotional appeals. Messages that use emotional appeals are more likely to be shared. And we see this online, particularly anger on social media. People are more likely to share things with words that provoke anger, outrage, hostility. And this improves the likelihood that people will discuss a topic with friends and families, but emotional arousal doesn't actually necessarily lead to action. It could also just trigger defensive responses as well. Southwell notes that one way to raise the chances of messages sharing is to elevate people's sense of confidence. If you can make them feel more confident about the content, they'll share it. So boosting it increases that likelihood of message sharing. And it's also key to other areas of communication campaigns. And we'll be talking about this as well when we're talking about raising self-efficacy. Now, what are some of the challenges in terms of getting people to share information? Southwell notes that there are several factors and groups them into categories. So the first one are these individual level factors. And we can start basically with demographics. Under this heading, we can see socioeconomic status and education level. And in both of those categories, research suggests that the higher the income level and education levels, the more likely people are to share information. They just feel more confident in doing so. So again, think back to boosting confidence in your message is going to increase people's willingness to share information. Another component is whether people perceive the topic to be relevant and important to them. So it's really important to note here that this, though, isn't about actual relevance, it's perceived relevance and importance. So an alcoholic looking at an ad against drunk driving, they may not actually perceive that it's relevant to them because they are not at a point where they've identified this as their drinking as a problem for them. So because they don't perceive the relevance, they don't pay attention, and therefore they don't share the information. Mental schema as well, we get to that understanding, can facilitate sharing as well. You have to have a framework for understanding the message. And context can also affect your sharing behavior and the perceived relevance. Are you at work, at home, different friend groups? You may share information with one group, but not with another. Another element here are personality traits. So Southwell points to individual differences on the level of sort of psychological personality traits, like shyness. People who are shy or experience high levels of communication apprehension, they're less likely to share information than, the gregarious person who's always talking and, comfortable socially with their peers. He also notes we can look at a personality type called sensation seeking. These are people who are high in the characteristic of sort of thrill seekers. So people who seek out novel, complex, and intense sensations show a greater willingness to take personal risks just for the sake of experience. And those risks can be physical, legal, emotional, or financial. And we see these tendencies in risk takers. And so, like, if you're a person who enjoys extreme sports, you're probably a sensation seeker. You may be more impulsive. And, those things, you may be more likely to share information by Southwell's model here, but you also may be more likely to engage in criminal activity, unsafe sexual practices, drug use, and gambling. So sensation seeking is this psychological model, and it actually may have some biologic components to it, some biochemical differences, but Southwell is using it here to talk about information sharing. So if you have this personality trait, you are more likely to share information. Southwell then goes to talk about community level factors. So what are some things that increases the likelihood of communication being shared within communities, of messages being shared? One element is social capital. And this refers to the resources available to group members because of the ties between those members. Community resources can be time, knowledge, help that's available, volunteering. And social capital can exist within communities and can bridge outside of communities. And in general, it works best when there are ties that are strong ties within and those that bridge out, so that you can get help from those who aren't immediately in your group. We can also look at community ties, the endurance, and residential stability. So deep connections between people and institutions really allow for information sharing. And the longer a community has been connected, so the same people living in the same houses over a long period of time, the more readily information is shared between them. We can also look at relationship history. So the closer relationship that you have, the more likely you are to share information. Hostile or surface information or surface relationships can hinder information sharing. But of course, that's topic specific, right? Because you can have had a really long relationship with, say, your father, and you may not want to talk to him about birth control or, relationship issues, STIs, etc. There may also be cultural differences as well, because cultural norms vary across groups, so that some information is readily disseminated in one group, but not in others. And again, that's topic specific, and it may also have to do with status within a community, and who speaks as an expert, who has the right to act in that way.